All right, so this is all about quality and innovation in youth work and DOC. The way we work is that we have partners in 33 countries, in total 35 partners in the meantime. We started out 10 years ago with just a handful of partners, and in every country we have a policy partner, which is in most of the countries the national agency of the Erasmus Youth in Action program. And we, in every country, have a research partner that is sometimes a research institute. In Italy, it's the University of Salerno at the moment. In Germany, it's an independent research institute, ICAP, with Hendrik Otten, with whom many of you know. In Turkey, it's two researchers, Eskehan and Asuman. And so that varies from country to country. But in total, when we have network meetings, which we do about once every year, we are about 120 people in the meantime or so. So it's quite a big network that we have built over the years. And so what we do is really monitoring the programs. We started out with Youth in Action, the previous generation of the youth program, continued with Erasmus Youth in Action, have added now the European Solidarity Corps to the monitoring that we do. And we do this through means of online surveys, which we run every 18 to 24 months. And we usually ask project participants after the project that they were involved in the programs is over, about 3 to 6 months prior to the surveys that we do. But we not only ask project participants, we also ask project organizers and project leaders, so those in the organization that actually implement the project or activity in the program. And then around that monitoring, which is the core of what we do and where all the countries in YiA are involved in, so all 33, we do thematic projects in addition. And we have only started doing that 4 years ago. We started out with 2 projects, one that looked at the effect of the Youth in Action program of Erasmus Plus on participation and citizenship of young people and whether it strengthens active citizenship of young people over a longer period of time. And interviewed people and surveyed people over a period of 3 years continuously, and also the same people. So did almost a longitudinal study around that. And then we did another project on competence development and capacity building, where we looked at youth workers and youth leaders, so those that organize projects and activities in the program, and we interviewed them once before they went to a training activity in the program, could be youth worker mobility, could be TCA training course, and then twice after they came back. Once pretty soon after the activity, and then once a year after, to see how much of what they learned in that training and support activity they managed to take into their youth work practice with them. And we have just started 2 new projects. One looks at the impact of Key Action 2. So we look at innovation and good practice in the youth sector, and I'm going to talk in the second half of this session, I'm going to talk about this innovation project as well. And we have started a new project that looks at learning strategies of organization. And we very often use abbreviations for these projects. So the monitoring we call RayMon, the participation one we call RayPart, the competence development capacity building we call RayCap, innovation we call RayInno, learning strategies we call RayLearn. All right, so I already said distributed European network. So just to give you an idea of how big the data set is that we have built over those 10 years, we have more than 120,000 respondents to our online surveys from project participants. So more than 120,000 project participants have actually done the online surveys, completed them, and done it in a way that while we clean the data, we determine they have done this reasonably well. Right? Sometimes people just go there and they click and they're like, ah, another survey, yeah, blah, 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 blah. And we filter those things out with scripts and quite intricate procedures. So usually from the responses that we get in every round, we filter out about a quarter of the responses. So we're quite stringent about that. And from project leaders and project organizers, over those 10 years, we have a little more than 30,000 respondents that we have gotten through these online surveys. And across the different thematic projects, we have conducted way more than 1,000 qualitative interviews, which often take an hour and a half. So you see what we have built up is quite substantive. And it's always difficult for a short session like this to pick out the things that sort of we guess you might find interesting. So I have picked out a few, mixed across our different projects, findings and recommendations and insights on quality and innovation. But there is, of course, a lot more in the data. We have some reports which are behind you. We are not yet very good at making these reports look fantastically attractive, but we are working on that. So at the moment, they are still a little dry to read at times, but we are renewing the layout of them this year, and then hopefully soon they will also look a little more modern. We produce them in different formats because the first thing that we always produce is a full research report. So the one that we produced most recently is the one on the competence development capacity building project, RECAP, and it has a sweet short 320 pages. And after we do that, we write executive summaries, we write fact sheets, and so there are about every project different length and formats of reports available on our website, which is researchyouth.eu. And our Twitter handle is just researchyouth, always straightforward and simple. So a couple of things on quality that I have brought with me. And the question that we ask participants is, what have you learned about in your project? And so the question to you is now, what do you think project participants have learned about most and least? Well, this is the top 5, right? So it's not a trick or anything. So what you see here is very close to what you thought, with one distinct exception. So cultural diversity is indeed what project participants say they have learned most frequently and most about. Cultural diversity, 69%. Then, however, comes youth work, 57%. And then comes non-formal learning, 49%, personal development, 48%, non-discrimination, 40%. And there is a lot of other things there which come from what project applicants usually say their project is about, right? So we only use options that are also available for people to actually say in the project application. But those are the top 5. Cultural diversity, indeed, the strongest, which in particular policymakers are often surprised about, right? They think it's youth work, it's non-formal education, it's sort of, you know, it's us living, it's the methodology of our sector that young people learn most about, but it is in fact cultural diversity. We have a couple of questions in our surveys around that. Do you appreciate cultural diversity more than before? What have you learned most about? It pops up in several spaces, and it's almost always one of the strongest returns. And this is also one of the qualities of the program. So I have both with me, some of the things that work extremely well in the program and some of the things that work less well in the program and where quality needs to be strengthened. But this is an area where the program is really fantastic. It's intercultural learning at its best. Young people and project participants perceive it as a safe space. They really come to these activities mostly with positive curiosity. They explore them, they explore other cultures, other languages, they have fun doing it, and they come back and they say, I understand other cultures better, I appreciate other cultures more, I understand the richness of cultural diversity in Europe more and better. So that's really something that the program does extremely well, and something that we can also be much more adamant in promoting the program for. All right. Next question for you is this one. How did the project affect participants? So they appreciate cultural diversity more, 65%, 66%. They are more committed to fight discrimination, 49%. They feel more European than before, 48%. And these questions always work. We ask them, is it more than before the project or activity, the same or less? And there's always like 0.5% or 1% that says it's less than before. And part of us really wants to find out what exactly happened during those projects. But then in the grand scheme of things, this is like 50 or 60 people, or sometimes 100. So we didn't yet design a project around finding out what exactly the story is there. But you see that most of these projects, which is interesting in combination with another finding I'm going to show you later on, most of the projects actually still strengthen and improve and make these things stronger. So something that we hear very often is, you know, that we only reach the elite and those that are already in love with Europe, and to some extent that is also true, but nonetheless it makes these things, it makes these values and these actions and the desire to change something still much stronger in them. And then this here, I don't have a Mentimeter question about, I think. Through my participation in this project or activity, I improved my ability to, and then they have a couple of options that they can respond to. And the top three are, they get along with people who have different cultures, not a surprise, the cultural diversity aspect again. They learn better, they have improved their ability to cooperate in a team, and they have improved their ability to communicate with people speaking in another language. And there are a couple of others which are so often referred to as soft skills in our surveys. So it's very easy also to argue towards policymakers, towards funders, what these project activities and program activities actually do. Namely, not only make everyone feel better about Europe, which is what so often is the stereotype, you know, people go there, they feel better about Europe, they go home. No, they actually learn skills that are useful in many other contexts. And our surveys show that with really impressive numbers. I mean, it's like, you know, it's practically everyone. You know, it's between, we have, I think, 10 of these skills that are above 90% of young people saying, this has improved my ability to. And for project leaders and organizers, this is even stronger. Across the board, which also makes sense because they are involved in these projects longer, right? They really organize them from often the project application to the project reporting, so they are more involved and more strongly involved than project participants, so the learning effects also are stronger with them. So this is something else that the program is really good at. It's a crucial training ground, in particular for new youth leaders, youth trainers, and youth workers, people who are new at least to the international aspect of youth work. Not necessarily youth work per se, but to international, intercultural youth work. There are a variety of training formats which build the capacity of people in the youth sector. They become more competent, more confident, and the feedback about these things is generally very positive. Back to Mentimeter with a new question for you. Well, this we have already asked, okay, so I'm gonna switch to this one. What have project participants learned the least? This is the bottom three, which is still more than 50% of people in each instance saying, my participation in the project or activity has improved my ability to, but to use smartphones, tablets, 51%, to discuss political topics seriously, 62%, to produce media content, 64%. Now, the use of smartphones and tablets, we are generally less concerned about. That's a response option that was already there 10 years ago, where this was more of an issue, and which we are going to throw out in the next cycle. I just wanted to leave it here sort of to show you where that ladder ends. The other two are more of an issue, in particular because young people and also youth workers, youth leaders, youth trainers increasingly go to activities and want to discuss political issues seriously and feel that the space and the formats for that are lacking. So that's indeed a problematic aspect where quality of the program is at the moment not good enough. And the production of media content, another issue that's problematic in several ways. So young people actually want to do that more, but are often held back from organizations for a variety of reasons, because they think they don't have the time, because they think they don't have the skill, because they're afraid that young people might say something about their organization or their project that they can't control, so they'd rather say, no, we don't do Instagram stories or whatever it is. but then also there's an extreme mismatch between what youth leaders, youth organizers, project organizers think young people learn about the production of media content and what young people actually say. So that's one of the areas where self-assessment of participants is much, much lower than the trainers and youth workers believe, who are much more positive and misleadingly positive about this. So at the moment, youth workers think they do this quite well, and project participants actually tell them, no, you don't. So what this means is that the program, and we have been saying this for about a year now, it's not a new finding, and hopefully this will also be to some extent reflected in the formats of the new program generation. The youth program needs new formats to address current social and political development spaces where young people and youth professionals have the feeling they can, in a safe space, openly discuss things like rising populism, like fake news, like what to do with a country that doesn't respect the human rights charter of the European Union, but is a member of the European Union. All of these things people want to discuss, but have the feeling that they can't do this fully. So this is one area where quality needs to be strengthened, in particular in the new generation. And another one is, and we see this elsewhere, not only with the media production aspect, we have a couple of questions and items around that. There is a growing gap between digitalization and youth work. Conferences like this that we organize at European level can be a bit misleading about the overall picture, because we have great colleagues from YiA here who are, you know, in a fantastic situation in Finland where they actually have a specialized center to support youth work and digital aspects of youth work, which most other countries have not. But the reality in the program is that most of everything surrounding the projects still happens by very old-fashioned digital means or happens in analog ways. During trainings and activities, before and after, and you all know this from, I mean, if you organize activities in the program context, you have seen the Facebook graveyards that projects typically build, right? It's a group, and then there's a flurry of activity for 2 weeks afterwards, and then there's a flurry of activity with the next deadline, and mostly after the next application deadline, this group joins the graveyards that are elsewhere. And so we are just, as a sector across the board, the few beacon highlights notwithstanding, we are just not very good at using digitalization yet for and in youth work. And the surveys that we do and the thematic research projects that we do really show that. And even, I think yesterday in one of the workshops, YiA actually has this as one of their aims, as a part of their mission statement, is to overcome the fear of youth workers to engage in digital spaces. And this is something we found out in our research project around capacity building, competence development, where we interviewed youth workers and youth leaders. And this fear is very real, right? It's because they begin to understand that in digital spaces, the power relation is a very different one than in youth work normally, right? Youth work is often in a physical space, a youth hub, a youth house, a training center, and this is usually a space the youth worker controls. Digital spaces are the opposite. If anyone controls them, it's young people. And this diversion of power is something that youth workers really, really struggle with. Also because they don't feel competent digitally themselves, right? So if you don't know how to move around with a confident voice and a curated persona on Instagram, Snapchat, or wherever, then you have trouble engaging with young people who know how to do this very well. So, back to Menti. Hello, little puppy. So here is an interesting question. Which effect has the strongest gender gap? So again, this is about effects of the projects on participants. We asked them, you know, do you engage in civil society more than before the project, the same or less than before the project? And these are all about more. I feel more European, I participate more in politics, I engage more in civil society. They all have a gender gap. Your question is, my question to you is, which has the strongest? It is indeed, like you say, I participate more in politics. The gender gap is 6%, which is, if you look at the total numbers, so it's 22.4% of girls and young women who responded, who said, I participate more in politics, and it's 28.4% who said this from the side of boys and young men. And that's for our sector and our program and a reality in youth work, which is in the meantime most often dominated by female staff and increasingly also female volunteers in most parts of our sector. This is a particular problematic gender gap. But also I feel more European, gender gap of more than 4%. I engage more in civil society, 3%, and then most of the other items have a gender gap that's below 3%. Which then is an area where technically we are below our, or within our margin of error, so we can't really say that we have one. That's of course, you know, in particular in a survey that has a limited amount of time, the question is always, are you actually looking at a proxy indicator and is it hiding something? But here we've actually looked into that and we are pretty certain this is actually a gender-driven issue. And for now, all that we say is that the program just needs to pay more attention to gendered effects of the program, because at the moment, this is not really an issue of discussion, at least not at a European level, and not in the management of the program, not in the implementation of the program. But because there is actually a gender gap, in particular in the jump from implementing youth work in most European countries to managing and policy directing youth work, we think it's important to actually look at that and make sure that the program does not reinforce these effects and introduce glass walls where they really shouldn't be. Something that we would, for example, also like to look at is how many of the people who go from project participants on and become project organizers, whether there is a gender gap there, right? We don't know yet. So here is a free-range question for you. How many participants you think had been part of a similar project before? And you can answer in percent from 0 to 100 with any number that you would like to see. So have you participated in a similar project before? And so we asked them, yes. And if they say yes, well, was it a project funded by a European youth program? Was it a project funded by another European program? Was it just another similar project, no matter where the funding came from, then not from European level, or none of the above? And what you see here, and we do think this is actually problematic, is that 37% of project participants have not ever before participated in a similar project. And that's definitely less than what the program wants to achieve, right? I mean, the program has, it's one of its objectives to reach out to young people who have not been involved in youth work before, who don't typically benefit from youth work activities. And then this number is definitely relatively far away from that aim. And so what we recommend on the basis of that is that the program needs to get better at strengthening and also reproducing diversity in the youth population across Europe. And what is, though, important to say and also to acknowledge is that the program actually works reasonably well for young people from migration backgrounds, from disadvantaged backgrounds, as long as they make it into the program, which many of them don't. And it doesn't work as well for them as for people from well-educated backgrounds, non-migration backgrounds, mainstream society. And the program does remain over-proportionately attractive for highly educated young people. The proportion of people with higher education background themselves, as well as their families and parents, grows in the program much quicker than in the overall European population. So the program really seeks and attracts highly educated young people. and does a lot less than it wants to in attracting people who have less access to education. And another thing that is interesting is that this is again an area of mismatch, similar to what I said about media production before. Youth workers, youth leaders, youth trainers think that they respond to the needs of people with fewer opportunities quite well. Those young people actually say that's not true, at least not to the extent that the youth workers or youth leaders think. So it's one of these areas where both in the writing of applications, a lot of magic happens, right? It's, I mean, people think about, oh, well, you know, there's the typical question, do you involve young people with disadvantages, young people with disadvantages from disadvantaged backgrounds? Everybody says, yes, sure, we do. And then the question comes, well, who? And then that's where the magic begins. And the difference between what people write in the application and what people write in the report about what kinds of young people they actually involve shows that they do not know at the time of application writing often what are the young people with disadvantaged backgrounds that they're trying to seek and to reach. And that this then happens at later stages in the project proposals. So there's a lot of creative writing around this issue in the program at the moment. Yes?
Yeah, thanks. I think that what I wanted also to add is that more and more youth exchanges, for example, what we see is really that are not developed with young people, so that the selection of young people happens through social media or somehow else, which means that, of course, the target group is much less, fewer opportunities, as more those who already have access to the different networks and etc. So I think it quite clearly manifests also in the figures that you're saying.
Yeah, and it also shows in our surveys. I mean, we asked project participants, do you feel like you were meaningfully involved in the preparation of the project that you were participating in? And the number of people who say no is growing over time. So here you see this broken down by a number of activities that people have participated in previously. And the gist of it is then more than half of all returning participants actually have been involved in 3 or more similar projects, which was also, that's also a number that's been growing over the past years. In the previous program generation, it was still below 2. And then this is also interesting to think about and look at is previous participation, where we pulled out only those funded by a European youth program by activity type. So you see in EVS, it's least repetitive, or least number of returning, and in TCA and youth worker mobility is highest, right? In TCA it's 2/3. And this gets a new dimension in a moment when we look at another of our findings. Because what the program is actually not very good at the moment is training those experienced returning youth professionals, right? So they are very good at training newcomers to international youth work. Like I said, not necessarily youth work, but international youth work. They are not very good at the training of more experienced youth professionals who either have 5 or 10 years of methodological experience under their belt, or who maybe come from a thematic expertise into the program. So youth workers working with young offenders, for example. So thematic specialists and experienced youth workers have a much more critical reflection about the quality of the activities that they are involved in. And their expectation over time moves from, I will learn something new, to, I can expand my network, right? So it moves away from learning and towards, I can hopefully network better. And they almost, I mean, some of them, in the interviews that we did in recap, some of them had even become cynical about this. You know, they said, well, you know, yeah, what should I learn? I mean, I'm happy if I have one new energizer when I come home. And so this is something that the program already now, but also, and most importantly, in the next program generation, needs to think about how to train more experienced youth workers and youth professionals better.
If the Commission and consequently also the national agencies are fixing the fact that the rate of newcomers is too low and new people is too low, also the training activities are referred always to these people. So not specialized, not advanced training and so on. So obviously the youth workers that are more, the trainers that are more experienced have found less answers for their needs, because the offer is always oriented and more oriented in order to make newcomers coming in. So in reality it's a choice.
Yes, but the mismatch between the two doesn't work, right? So it's one thing to have the objective of bringing as many newcomers into the sector as possible, but then the reality is, and we have known this for a long time, that this does not work to the degree that the program wants it, right? And then not to react to that and say, well, we have more experienced youth workers, what do we do for them in terms of training, is a problem. Also, I mean, Marco was talking earlier today about a career path of youth workers and educational pathways of youth workers, and showing the work that the partnership has done on this, which documents how little professional possibilities exist across Europe for youth workers to actually train professionally for their job, and how many often their professional learning biographies are all over the place, because that's how it is, and and often it's the only way they can do it. And so many of them actually use the program for professionalization, right, for becoming better at what they do, and the program just doesn't acknowledge that yet, let's say. But yes, it's I agree. It's a total mismatch between what they want and what they get and where they're leading it. Fine. Which statement do project organizers disagree the most? Because this is, I think, the last aspect in terms of quality, and then I switch over to innovation. Because, of course, we have to talk about administration, about project application. Okay, so half of you think the project application was simple, was the statement project organizers disagreed with the most. And the puppy says, you're right. Oh, well, some of you have looked at this. That's okay. But, I mean, just to show, because sometimes it feels like these complaints are overproportionately strong. In the end, across our surveys and those 30,000 plus project organizers, it's 20% who strongly disagree with the statement that the project application was simple. And it is more than half who actually agree with that statement. And what we have to do and want to do is actually look at those 21, 22% who say this, and it often comes as a combination package, right? So they say, the application was not simple, the administration was not simple, the reporting was not easy. It's not completely the same group of people, but there's a strong relation between the three. And we actually want to look at that in the next program generation and find out what is it, who are these people, first of all, and what is it that makes it difficult for them? Because what we have seen is, I mean, there have been a number of attempts to make this more easy and to streamline applications and all of that. We know it all. And we have never seen any reaction in our surveys except that things became more critical, or people became more critical. So, for example, when they introduced those fantastic e-forms, right? You remember when we were all young, right? Back then in the day, and they introduced these e-forms. I mean, like, these numbers jumped like by 4 or 5%, you know, in the wrong direction, because the Commission wanted to make it easier and simpler, and that was the whole idea. And many more people than before felt it had made it more complicated, less easy, less accessible. So there is something that doesn't quite work with the attempts of making this easier, and we want to dig into what that is exactly to be able to give better advice on, you know, how to do things differently there. Who do you think runs the projects? All right. So you think it's, well, voluntary youth leaders and full-time youth workers to almost the same extent, part-time youth workers, and then other types. Now, The reality, however, is this. It's more than half voluntary youth leaders. It's 24% full-time youth workers, 9.5% part-time youth workers. Other types of youth leaders, 11.2, which is a wild potpourri of freelance trainers, which are like 2 or 3%, of interns, of EVS volunteers, and so. But this is, in fact, problematic. I mean, yes, it's the youth sector, and the youth sector lives off volunteering and promotes volunteering and finds volunteering important. But when you put it together with other findings from our other research projects, what you actually see is that the infrastructure of the youth sector is just not strong enough to carry so many activities and implement so many activities well. And that most organizations and networks do not consider having to rely on volunteers so strongly an asset, and do not consider it healthy, but consider it problematic, and do it anyway because it's better than not doing it at all, but actually would like to be able to bring more youth workers in, or bring more youth leaders in that are professionals in a non-voluntary capacity, at least partly. And of course, this is chronically underfinanced, but it also has to do with the rules of the different activities, right? In some project types in the program, you can't even put staff costs as a funding expenditure. That's only possible in very few of them. And so what I wanted to show you before I then switch to introducing our research project and innovation is this one, namely who runs the projects by activity type. So youth exchanges, so I picked out two, namely youth exchanges on the left, structured dialogue on the right. So youth exchanges, 2/3 are run by voluntary youth leaders, structured dialogue, 44%. Then full-time youth workers, youth exchanges, 18%, structured dialogue, almost 30. Part-time youth workers, youth exchanges, 6, structured dialogue, 12. And then other types of youth leaders, 9.3 and 14.8. And so it differs quite substantively between different project types. And in a way that youth exchanges are run by voluntary youth leaders is probably not a terrible thing at all, but not to the extent that the program forces organizations and applicants to do it. At least that's the feedback that we get.
You just said that one reason why it differs is the infrastructure. Do you have any information or numbers how it differs between countries? So that you can say like some countries, or that you can name some countries have a better infrastructure or not? Or don't you have this, like in your survey maybe you just didn't ask the question, or you just can't tell, and that would be maybe interesting or not? Yeah.
So my official answer is no, which I'm going to say straight into camera. No, I don't know anything about that. My unofficial answer is, in the end, we do know. I mean, for one, of course, we can disaggregate these numbers by countries. And for at least the bigger countries, that also still makes sense. I mean, for many smaller countries in particular, if you want to then distinguish by project type, that just becomes too small in terms of responses. But we have also done a study where we have looked at the infrastructure of youth work in the different countries and how strong or weak it is, which we are at the moment, I think, is in layout. So it's going to be out in summer, or just before summer. And we are going to use that in future surveys to weigh responses. And so we know. And it's, unfortunately, the infrastructure for a youth sector in most European countries is not very fantastic at all.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, I just thought I asked because I think everyone has an idea, like what countries have a strong or a weak infrastructure, but sometimes we get surprised if we take a systematic.
Yeah. It's that's a study that the Youth Partnership has done last year, and just published this year. Exactly, and the difference is that we really look at the underlying infrastructure and combine different things like. Is it actually possible to train to become a professional youth worker? Are there statutory youth centers? Is there budgeting for youth work at any of the governance levels? So we have combined various of these things and then come up with, I think, 5 groups of infrastructure clusters around Europe. And yes, they're not very obvious, and they're of course also changing over time. I mean, you know, you look at the situation in the UK, you look at the situation in France, you know, maybe 5 or 10 years ago you would have said they have fantastic infrastructure, definitely not at the moment. And so I think we'll also have to redo that probably with every program generation once or twice. All right. Then let me, I think, without, yeah, there is one Mentimeter question at the end, but I have puppies nonetheless. So I wanted to quickly show you what we are going to do on innovation in youth work. So on our research project YiA, the impact of Key Action 2. We have been pressured for quite some time to do something about this because, how do I say this in front of a camera? Let's say there is a variety of opinion about the impact and usefulness of that format in all sorts of levels and domains of our sectors, in the national agencies, at European Commission level, in the Parliament, in the sector, among researchers even. So there was a lot of heat to get something done about this, but because these projects take a long time until they're implemented, and then once the implementation is done, it takes some time until you can actually really grasp at least some impact, we were holding off until this year. Now, I would have liked to hold off longer, but I lost. And now here we are and have to do something about it. And just if you think about it, I mean, most of these projects actually have a duration of 3 years, right? So the earliest that some of them finished were technically in 2016. And then until you can really feel impact on the youth sector, you know, 2 or 3 years is very, very short. It's a very short period of time to really measure that. But nonetheless, we will try. So we have a research project, YiA, which has an aim. And these slides have a lot of text, not because I want you to read this all or I want to read it all to you, but so that in the documentation of the conference, it's just there for you to look up. So what we want to do is explore the role, impact, and potential of strategic partnerships as instruments to foster innovation and exchange good practice, which is the two things that they are supposed to do. We leave transnational youth initiatives gently aside, which were reintroduced in 2018. Reintroduced in 2018 because they are a very different format. And we are actually very excited about this. This is what this puppy is going to say. Then we have a couple of research objectives. So we're going to look at the variety of the formats, the diversity, explore their impact that they have on the youth sector, explore the potential of this format as an instrument more generally. We want to look at the beneficiaries, and if you remember the zoom out question, the first one has something to do with how consortia are established and formulates the observation that more and more applicants have to partner with for-profit organizations and big institutions that may not want that necessarily, so we want to look at that as well and look at how these consortia are actually put together. And then hopefully find out which key features of these partnerships have the strongest effect on delivering innovation and strengthening good practice. And if you think this is slightly confusing, maybe it helps you then to look at our research questions, of which we have 9. And they are here. Again, I'm not going to read them all, but so we're going to look at the types of organizations and networks. We're going to look at the types of projects. We are going to importantly look at how these projects define innovation and good practice themselves, because interestingly, the program guide has resisted the temptation to do that all these years. So none of the program guides will you actually ever find what the authors of the program guide think innovation is. It just doesn't say. It is all self-referential. So it says projects to foster innovation should foster innovation, which is not really much guidance. And so most of these projects have actually defined for themselves, and have to in the application form, they have to say what they think their innovation is. So we want to look at that and see whether there are particular types of innovation that come up more often, particular types of innovation that maybe don't come up at all, and the same with best practice, and then see whether we can map that across all of these. And then we want to, of course, also look at how do they go about it, how do they share the results, does that make any sense? Do they have an impact beyond the partnership that implements the project? So do they really have an effect on at least parts of the youth sector? Or is it mostly a partnership internal thing? We also want to look at how national agencies can best support these kind of projects, and look at which parts of youth work and the youth sector benefit most at the moment from these strategic partnerships, and whether they are parts of the sector that have not really benefited from Key Action 2 at all. So how do we do this? We have done a mapping of Key Action 2 projects, and I'm going to show you a little bit of the mapping that we have done before I let you go into coffee break. Then we're going to do case studies in all countries within the RAY network that have said they are interested enough in this project to join it, which they can do with our thematic ones. And these are 16. So we have 16 projects, 16 partner countries. And small countries do 2 case studies, big countries do 6. Some of them also do more, depending on. And small, medium, or big is in our network always decided by each country, not necessarily in terms of geographical size or inhabitants or something, but really how many Key Action 2 projects did they actually fund, right? So Norway, for example, in many ways, technically a small country, I mean geographically not, but in terms of the population and the youth sector, but they actually do 4 case studies because they funded a number of Key Action 2 projects, are interested in what they found out, so they do 4. Germany does 8, and so it always varies a little bit. But across the 16 countries, then we are probably going to have 60 to 70 case studies of Key Action 2 projects. And the way these work is that we do explorative interviews in these case studies. We start with the organization that implemented the project, the key applicant, and in those interviews we try and find people who can assess the impact and assess the role of the project in a wider context. That might be policymakers, researchers, people on the advisory board of an organization, or someone who sort of has a little bit of a distance, but is close enough to still be able to see the relation between the sector and the project. And we are also going to interview a couple of stakeholders with a systemic view in Europe on youth work and youth policy. And that will be structures like the Youth Partnership, the Council of Europe, the European Commission, the NA Head section, a couple of the bigger Key Action 3 strategic partnerships, definitely also the one on municipal youth work, so that we get a little bit of a feeling that goes across individual projects for what was the potential impact of Key Action 2 as a format on the youth sector. So what I wanted to show you, just so you get a little bit of a feeling of what we actually look at in terms of total numbers. Between 2014 and 2018, 1,306 projects were funded under Key Action 2, which does not include youth initiatives. That's only strategic partnerships. So that's 1,300. And you see that it fluctuated a little bit over the years. 2017 was a little more. And the total budget that the program has, well, granted, not necessarily spent yet, but granted is 143.5 million euros. And for comparison, and again, this is maybe numbers that is helpful to look at it with a little more peace of mind. In comparison, here are the different types of strategic partnerships, Key Action 2, that come from other sectors, not the youth sector. So there's cross-sector partnerships, 240 of those exist, of which 10 have a youth dimension. And then it's adult education, higher education, secondary education. There's a special format for school partnerships, which only involves schools. Secondary education can also involve anyone else. And then vocational education and training. And you see that our sector's partnerships, strategic partnerships, are comparatively little. And also cheap, which I actually want to show you now. So the total budget, it's 10,671 strategic partnerships, total budget of 1.8 billion euros, which is quite an investment into this project type, right, over 7 years. So we are really keen on seeing what, at least for the youth sector, comes out of it. But you already see here the relation of projects in blue to the relation of budgets in orange, which in the youth sector is the schools, right? Because they also have a budgetary ceiling of 250,000 euros, but schools exclusively and the youth sector are the only ones where there are more projects than budget was spent in relation. And so this is also an interesting one. It shows you the budget distribution of strategic partnerships in the youth sector. So this is a budget of below 50,000 euros for a strategic partnership. Again, without youth initiatives, they are already out. Below 70, below 100, below 150, and then over here, below 450,000, which is the ceiling for the action.
But this was expected with this one youth program, it's a 10% of all budget of Erasmus+.
Oh, it's for the other sectors the same. Yes. Yes. Yes, you do.
Thanks. I have a question regarding the research you're going to conduct.
Yes.
Are you going to consider, take into consideration only the projects who were approved, or as well the projects who were rejected, and maybe research why they were rejected as an innovative project, or just a question?
We would love to, but not in 2019. So if this project format stays around in the next program generation, and at the moment everything looks like that, then we'll definitely look into that, but not in this package for 2019. And then you see here just how this looks for the other sectors, right? And that's us here, right? No, here, the cute one on the right, that's us. And so this is something we want to find out, because this cannot be explained only with budgetary limitations or restrictions alone. So we want to know, is it the youth sector that decisively wants to organize smaller strategic partnerships because they are quicker, faster, easier to apply for? Or is this a systemic problem somewhere? We don't know. No. We all have assumptions about that. We definitely do not know. When we showed this to national agencies and the European Commission, they all sat there with an open mouth. Nobody knew that. Even though these figures are readily available, it took us like, what, 2 hours to figure this out? And people were not aware of that. And it's, of course, you also understand in a way, right? People do their work and they have little access to a larger picture, little opportunity to paint it, and so on. So, you know, not at every meeting that people have, they look at these numbers, of course. But that nobody had actually done that, that surprised us a little bit. And then something else that I've included in the presentation, but I'm not going to go through it, also because we are approaching the end of the session, is how the Key Action 2 has actually worked in terms of thematic priorities over time, because it has really changed from year to year, right? This dichotomy between innovation and good practice exists since 2016. Now in 2019, everything was relabeled to align with the new European Youth Strategy, and within each of these pockets, the program guide added and removed thematic priorities. I mean, like there was no tomorrow. It's really, I mean, we have a map of that, and it's impressive. I mean, there was, well, let's say like this. There wasn't much consistency to the thematic prioritization of Key Action 2 strategic partnerships in this program generation yet. And so the picture that you then see here once as a word cloud, and I also have it in a moment just as a list, is then also the result of that. So there is very little concentration and very large amount of diversity in those key action 2 projects, the 1,306 that were financed so far. And because word cloud applications are still a little bit silly, I actually show you the list, which is categories that the European Commission has devised. Right? It's, I mean, in the data set that we got from them, these are categories that they have made up. So you see, for example, the second category, youth, in parentheses, participation, youth work, youth policy. So it doesn't really say yet all too much, but what you see, entrepreneur learning, entrepreneurship education, a very strong one, was also until 2019 one of 3 overarching thematic priorities, so that's not a surprise. But the strongest one is working on educational things, developing curricula, developing training methods, implementing new training approaches. That's the strongest. And then goes via youth unemployment, ICT, digital competences, democracy, and then through a couple of areas, environment and climate change, surprisingly weak, we thought. And then it goes down to research and innovation, which is a little bit sad. If you want to reach us ever again, then you can do that with the email addresses here. Carmen, who many of you have seen already, works at the Austrian National Agency and is the network coordinator. And Helmut, Fennis, and myself, we are the research coordinators of the RE network, and you can either reach us with generic email addresses or also personally, just straightforward with our first name at researchyouth.net. All right. Well then, thank you very much.